Well, good morning. I'm delighted to start our session by focusing on the role of women in rebuilding lives post-disaster. Specifically, these are women from a migrant farm worker community in Florida, and this presentation is premised on several points. First, that the empowerment of women to promote disaster risk reduction is a global concern, that the lessons learned from these women in the farm labor community have important lessons for us as social workers. And we'll give an example of how we're starting to apply some of that learning today. And that this gave an opportunity for us to begin to develop a toolkit through the use of personal and community assets to build greater adaptive capacity. Again, this is giving credit to our partnership support, and I want to thank Dr. Drolet for pulling all this together. We've been working on this for several years, and it has been an amazing experience for all of us, and I just want to thank her for that. It was also a privilege for me to be invited into a migrant farm worker community and to have the women there share their experiences as they were impacted by a natural disaster. So I want to share with you a tale of a migrant community. And this takes place in Volusia County, Florida. You might be familiar with Volusia County because it's the home to Daytona Beach. Used to be a popular spring break place. They've now found more other places to hang out, but it still is quite a tourist area. But in addition to that, Volusia County is known to be a very rich agricultural area. One of its most productive crops is actually fern farming. So when you get bouquets of flowers and they have those ferns inserted, they're known as the fern capital of the world. A fact I did not know until I did this study. And certainly there are other crops that are harvested, but fern farming is pretty important. They're situated along the Atlantic coast of the state with a population of about 500,000. And within that community, because of its agricultural richness, there's a very concentrated migrant farm worker population. This group tends to have limited English proficiency, also referred to as LEP. In the United States, under FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Administration, LEP populations are considered a particularly vulnerable and special population and therefore qualify for special services in case of a disaster. What we found is that although the policy may state that, that's not really the practice. This population is also known to have limited education, particularly secondary education, high rates of poverty, high rates of undocumented status, primarily coming from Mexico, and living in substandard housing. So to give you a little bit of information about hurricanes in Florida, in the U.S., the hurricane season extends from June 1st through November 30th. So 6 months of the year we're under our hurricane season. This is a graphic that shows 3 hurricanes, Charlie, Francis, and Jean, that crisscrossed the state of Florida in 2004. The darkest red area shows where there was direct impact from all 3 of those hurricanes. 2004, 2005 were very busy hurricane seasons for us, with the first being Charlie, which was a Category 4 hurricane. Hurricanes are measured as Cat 1 through Cat 5, with a Cat 5 being the most catastrophic. So Charlie hit the coast of Florida as a Cat 4, causing over $16 billion in damages. That was followed a couple weeks later by Hurricane Francis, a couple weeks later by Hurricane Ivan, a couple weeks later by Hurricane Jean. In 2005, there were Hurricanes Dennis and Wilma, both Category 3, and Wilma was one of the most costliest of the season, with over $20 billion in damages. What we know from emergency management is that you look at hurricanes as being wind and rain events, and you're supposed to hide from the wind, so you find a safe shelter and you hunker down. And you're supposed to run from the rain so that you find higher ground. You actually evacuate the area and get someplace safe. The most threatening is when there's wind-driven rain, because that's what causes the storm surge. It pushes those coastal waters inland, and a lot of deaths result because of inland flooding. So this work reports on a focus group that was conducted with migrant women in this farm worker community. There's some basic demographics, the mean age of 26 years. Let me get kind of right to our data, what we found. So we found 5 major challenges after having this focus group with these women. The first one being issues of trust. Because this is a population that's considered to have a high percentage of undocumented individuals, there's a fear of government officials, there's a fear of law enforcement, and therefore they become a very hidden population. They tend not to blend with the larger community, they tend to stay very close-knit, and just kind of fly under the radar, if you will. Because they're also a limited English proficiency or LEP population, there's definite issues in terms of being able to communicate with those outside of their immediate circle. So as an example, one woman told us, the police came to the disaster area to check the status of the people, and they said everything was okay. Another woman described the situation, and she said, my home smelled like fish, and it had flies. My children were very young, and we did not have any lights or water, and it was awful. I asked FEMA for assistance, but they did not provide it because I did not qualify. So the situation here is that you had clear devastation within that community, but yet when someone from law enforcement or from government would come by, they would do a quick assessment and say, no, you're okay. We're not going to provide services in this area of the county, and they moved on to areas that were more affluent. A second challenge that the women talked about was this lack of preparedness. And this becomes almost like a cry wolf syndrome for this community. So one woman shared, in that moment, there weren't any plans. Everyone would say a hurricane is coming, but it never came. When it came, we were not prepared. Because of the lack of ability to communicate with the broader community, and that includes through print media, through TV, through radio, people would pass word mouth to mouth and say a hurricane's coming, and then it would miss the area. So after a while, people just discarded that information. They weren't able to keep up with regular reports that were coming from the weather media to let them know that in fact it was going to make a direct hit. Oops, I'm sorry about that. The third challenge was the loss of livelihoods. One woman explained, a lot of the migrant workers support their families off the greens and ferns, and after the hurricane, nothing grew the same. It just completely destroyed everything. So since the fields and the crops were destroyed, this meant there was no work, and the men ended up leaving their families behind, trying to scatter various places to pick up other kinds of work opportunities. That left the women having to figure out what to do, picking up after the disaster and helping to rebuild their lives. Fourth challenge, insufficient disaster resources. Because this is such a close-knit and closed-off community, women started to experience what I'll call the yo-yo effect. You're on your own. And so one woman explained it by saying, you know, there really were, we had to go it alone. There really were no services coming to us from local, state, or national government. Even nonprofit organizations were not providing the kinds of services that they needed for recovery. And because of a lack of alternatives to relocate, they ended up staying in these areas that have high risk. Where other people would evacuate and would go to shelters, this population is very afraid. Again, those trust issues. And so they would stay put and then suffer the consequences. And then the fifth major challenge that we identified was the lack of voice in hazards planning. The reality is that these women would deal on a daily basis with micro disasters. And I identify micro disasters as things like trying to put food on the table for their family each day, trying to have enough money to provide for basic needs, trying to figure out transportation issues, trying to fix up substandard housing. So while women were dealing with these things every day, emergency management tends to come from a more, in the US, more white male, top-down command style. It does not work well with a community like migrant farm laborers. So our takeaways from this, we found three strengths, theme areas of strengths. The first being social networks. The availability of cell phones to women helps maintain their social connections. And again, because this is such a tight, close-knit community, the better they're able to communicate with each other, the stronger they become as a force to deal with these situations. There's a lack of media outlets that provide information in Spanish. Paper, radio, TV. And so women really rely on being able to have regular communication with each other to exchange information. They also talked about the use of social clubs, or what they were referring to as ladies' associations, so that they had an opportunity to come together in a more formal way, be able to exchange information. It's almost like thinking about mutual aid groups that would come together. Second area of strength was around greater unity. As one woman explained, I think a lot of people came closer together, like people did not take their friends or family for granted, and neighbors were helping each other. This told us a lot about the importance of bonding social capital within this community. Kinship ties are incredibly important. Ties with the neighbors are incredibly important. And having a shared sense of faith were very important elements for this group of women. And they talked about how that influenced and was kind of the glue that held things together for them. And then the third strength was grassroots action. This is where the collective actions of women showed how they were able to organize their efforts and provide for their own relief. So as one participant stated, Anna opened a distribution site there in her front yard. People started to bring food to her house, and we started supporting her so we can distribute food into the community while we look for people who were in need. Anna, this single individual, became the touch point for that migrant farm worker community. She was just ordinary person, quiet, very private, but at some point she decided to use the knowledge that she had to speak up and to help organize the other women that were around her. So they would go out and they would gather whatever they could salvage from their homes, from the community. They would get the word out to other people about salvaging whatever you could. Food that was going to spoil, anything. Bring it to Anna's front yard. That became their touch point. And from there, they were able to distribute those resources, whatever they had, to others within their community because they were not getting the outside assistance that they needed. So what can we as social workers take away from the experience of these migrant women? We are working on the development of a toolkit called GROW, which is Global Resilience Through Opportunities for Women. The purpose is to be able to capture and record the strategies that women around the world use to promote resilience both pre and post disaster. And so it really looks at women as being agents of change to overcome these gender inequities that exist in hazards management, particularly in the US and certainly in other countries. And this is definitely a work in progress. So this was the impetus for us to be able to launch this idea. The toolkit has 3 key themes around community organizing, capacity building, and leadership development. Under community organizing, we're looking at tools that support grassroots organizing and how to mobilize your resources. These strategies are used to promote collective action through networking. And this was really central to what Anna was able to do in her community with her neighbors. Second is around capacity building. These would be the tools that increase knowledge and skills, help with community problem solving and community-based decision making, ways to enhance the use of communications technology as a way for very closed communities to be able to reach out and pull in information from outside. This is so important to raising awareness, and we know as social workers that the better we are to be able to inform and educate others on preparedness, the better we are for being able to lower the risk and vulnerability. One of the things that we try to make very clear, particularly to emergency managers, is that there needs to be respect for community knowledge. The community knows what the community knows. And as an emergency manager, you're well trained and skilled in how to help people beyond the disaster. But unless you really understand the lived experiences of those individuals in those communities, it's very hard to bridge that to really be able to be effective in what you do. So that brings us to the leadership development piece. And the leadership development is not only about preparing women and adolescent girls to be able to take on leadership roles, particularly as change agents in disasters and emergency management, but also to cultivate a voice and to bridge that gap between professional emergency managers and vulnerable communities. So each year we've been doing a presentation at the Governor's Hurricane Conference back in Florida. And as a social worker, we go out and we train and educate emergency managers on working with migrant and LEP communities. So we try to inform them and provide them with strategies based upon the knowledge and experience of people in those communities on how best to form that bridge to work together. So here's a very quick example of some of the work that we do. This is just one sort of activity that we work on, and it's called building or polishing a gem, taking your community assets and turning them into a grassroots emergency management plan. And our FEMA director in the U.S. is very big on this idea of whole community, that it's not just about emergency management, that it's really about all the sectors and not just government support, but from the grassroots on up. So this fits very well with what we're trying to do as social workers and what we believe in as agents of change. So some of the things that we talk about when we go out into communities working on community-based disaster preparedness is helping different groups understand what disaster preparedness services are currently provided in your community, what services need to be provided that aren't, what are the barriers to accessing services, and what assets do you have to overcome those barriers and make your community more disaster resilient. Those are 4 key questions that we work with in communities to get them thinking about what do we have, how can we use what we have, and how can it make a difference for us. We then take that information and match them with emergency managers in their communities so that the emergency managers can say, okay, now I have a better understanding of what resources you have available and how you think those would help. Here's what we need on the emergency management side, so we start to build that communication and build that bridge. So we do an activity about turning assets into resources. So we help people understand what we call the gots, the gives, and the gets. So everyone has something to give and everybody needs something. We can't make it alone. We're all interdependent. So we start off by asking people to think about what I've got and to have them list 3 or 4 assets that they have available that could help their community build a preparedness plan. And it could be anything from I've got meeting space available or I know how to bake. Okay? It sounds very simplistic, but the reality is everyone feels included and everyone feels valued in some way. In addition to your GOTS, you have to think about what you can give. So of the things that I have, I get to pick a few that I can then put to use in my community. So maybe I can deliver flyers announcing meetings. Maybe I can offer up a church hall if I'm the local pastor in that community to make that available. But in the exchange, there's something that you need to get. So now you need to think about a couple of things that you need in order to fill the gap within your assets. So it might be something like, I need to get help putting a tarp on my roof, or I need to get help organizing a preparedness resource directory. So everyone has a role. We all have something, we all need something. So from the growth strategies that we've developed so far by working with this particular migrant group, I just want to share with you kind of what they've done. They've created the Alliance of Active Women. This was started with Anna. They've developed a pointed distribution, so they are a formally recognized point in the future for any disasters that hit that community where services and resources will be delivered. They've developed a formalized information exchange. They've created a community emergency response team. They've gotten small funding for a neighborhood emergency preparedness plan with the county health department, and we've developed relationships with Univision and Telemundo to be able to publicize any weather information in Spanish and particularly targeted to that community. So in moving forward, our next step has been working with Ghana and developing the strategies from women in Ghana, particularly in the Accra area and the Volta Basin region, to see what works best for them to help empower them in disasters. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to set this up next for Desley.